My name is Rebecca Foster, and I'm 43 years old. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, in a neighborhood that feels like it was designed to be the picture-perfect backdrop for a Christian family's life. Tree-lined streets, white picket fences, and neighbors who know each other's business in that particular way that only happens in small communities, regardless of how big the city actually is. I'm going to tell you something today that I've never said out loud before. Something that I've spent the last 5 years convinced I should keep secret. Something that I was made to believe was my fault, my inadequacy, my failure as a wife and as a woman. But I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to protect the image of a man who spent years breaking me down piece by piece, all while standing in front of hundreds of people every Sunday morning, preaching about love, sacrifice, and Christian values. My husband's name was Daniel Harrison, and he was the senior pastor at Grace Fellowship Church, one of the largest churches in Nashville. Not mega church level, but significant. We had about 2,000 members at our peak. Daniel was respected. He was known for his compassionate sermons, his engagement with the community, his visible commitment to his faith. People came to him for counsel. They trusted him. They believed in him. And in the privacy of our home, he was someone completely different. I want to be clear about something before I start this story. I'm not here to attack Christianity or religious faith. Plenty of people have deep, genuine spiritual lives that bring them peace and meaning. What I'm here to talk about is how faith can be weaponized, how a position of spiritual authority can become a tool for manipulation, how the expectation of wifely submission can become a justification for control. I met Daniel in college. I was 21, a junior at Belmont University, studying communications. He was 24, a youth pastor at a church not far from campus. He came to speak at a Christian student group I attended, and afterward, he made a point to talk to me. He was charming. He was spiritual but not preachy in that moment. He asked about my life, my hopes, my faith. He made me feel seen. Within 6 months, we were dating. Within 2 years, he proposed. The engagement was about 1.5 years long. Plenty of time for me to see who he really was, plenty of time for any red flags to surface. But I didn't see any. Or maybe I saw them and convinced myself they meant something else. He was ambitious, but I thought that was drive. He was very focused on having the right image in public, but I thought that was professionalism. He had strong opinions about how a wife should behave, but I thought that was just his understanding of traditional values. I was 24 when we got married. He was 27. I thought I knew him. Our wedding was beautiful. It was in a church, obviously. We had about 300 people. My parents cried happy tears. His parents smiled with pride. Everyone said we were the perfect match. The perfect pastor and his devoted wife. The perfect Christian couple. The first year of marriage was fine. It wasn't exciting or particularly romantic, but it was fine. Daniel was working long hours building his career at church. He was charismatic, and people responded to him. His sermons started getting more attention. He was beginning to be seen as someone who could lead a larger church. But then something shifted around year 2. I can't point to an exact moment. It was gradual, like a photograph fading in sunlight. But what shifted was that sex became important to him. Not important in the way that physical intimacy matters in most marriages. Important in a way that felt obsessive, urgent, demanding. It started with comments. We should be having more sex. It's part of being a good wife. It's in the Bible. The body of a wife belongs to her husband. I remember him saying this one morning while I was making breakfast. He was quoting from 1 Corinthians. He was using scripture to justify his escalating expectations around our intimate life. At first, I thought he was right. I'd been raised in the church. I knew these verses. I believed that submission was part of Christian marriage. So I started trying harder. I initiated sex more often. I said yes when he wanted it, even when I wasn't in the mood, even when I was exhausted from work or from managing the household. But it was never enough. The frequency kept increasing. 3 times a week, 4 times a week, then every day. And if a day went by when we didn't have sex, he would be withdrawn and cold. He would give me looks that communicated disappointment. He would make comments about other wives who took care of their husbands properly. He would suggest that my unwillingness was a form of rejection, that I didn't really love him, that I was being selfish. I was 30 years old when this started happening. I was working full-time in marketing. I was managing the household. I was volunteering at the church in various capacities because that was what the pastor's wife was supposed to do. I was exhausted, and every single day, there was this expectation hanging over me. This pressure, this demand. Daniel would wake up, and the first thing he would do is touch me in a way that made clear what he wanted. If I said I wasn't feeling it, his face would change. His voice would change. Rebecca, I work very hard. I serve this community. I preach about sacrifice and love. The least you can do is give me this one thing. One thing. As if sex every single day was one thing. As if it wasn't consuming my mental and emotional energy constantly. I started to dread bedtime. I started to avoid being alone with him. I started to feel this constant anxiety in my body, this sense of owing him something that I couldn't quite deliver to his satisfaction. And here's the thing that makes me angry when I think about it now. He used scripture to justify this. He would cite passages about wives submitting to their husbands, about the marriage bed being undefiled, about physical intimacy being a wife's responsibility. He weaponized the Bible. If you were a better Christian wife, you wouldn't be resisting me, he would say. You're being disobedient. You're being prideful. You're putting your own comfort above your husband's needs. I started to believe him. I started to think that there was something wrong with me, that I was selfish, that I was inadequate, that maybe if I just tried harder, just gave more, just sacrificed more of myself, he would be satisfied and we could have peace in our marriage. By year 3 of marriage, I had become unrecognizable to myself. I was thin from stress. I wasn't sleeping well. I had anxiety that would spike at certain times of the day. I was constantly in my head, constantly managing my emotions, constantly bracing for the next demand. And I told nobody. That's the thing about this type of situation. It's incredibly isolating. You can't just casually mention to your friends that your husband expects sex every single day, regardless of your feelings, regardless of your physical state, regardless of anything else. It's too intimate. It's too embarrassing. It makes you feel like you're admitting to something shameful. Also, the messaging I had received my entire life was that this was normal, that husbands wanted sex and wives were supposed to provide it, that this was just how marriage worked, that complaining about it was ungrateful and selfish. There were moments when I tried to talk to Daniel about how I was feeling. I tried to use gentle language so I wouldn't seem confrontational. I feel like the pressure around sex is affecting how I feel about intimacy, I said once. I think we should maybe talk about this with someone. A counselor or something. He immediately shut that down. A counselor? Rebecca, what would we tell them? That my wife doesn't want to have sex with me? That's not a marriage problem. That's a you problem. You need to figure out why you're so resistant to your husband. It's not normal. He made it sound like there was something psychologically wrong with me. Like my resistance was a symptom of depression or trauma or something that needed to be treated. It never occurred to him, or at least he never acknowledged, that maybe my body's resistance was trying to tell me something. That maybe my anxiety and my exhaustion and my dread were signs that something was fundamentally wrong with the dynamic between us. By year 5 of marriage, I was 35 years old, and I was completely isolated. I didn't have close friendships anymore. I had church friendships, but those were conditional on maintaining the image of the perfect pastor's wife. I couldn't confide in anyone because it would reflect poorly on Daniel and the church. My family lived out of state, and I had distanced myself from them because Daniel had convinced me they weren't supportive of our marriage. He had told me that they were jealous of my success with him, that they were trying to undermine our relationship, that they didn't respect his authority as my husband. In reality, I think they were concerned about me. I think they saw the changes, but I was so deep in the manipulation by that point that I couldn't hear their concerns. I could only hear Daniel's interpretation of their concerns. I was completely alone. And then in 2015, I reached a breaking point that I didn't even know I was building toward. It was a Wednesday night. We had been married for 8 years at this point. I was 38. Daniel had been the senior pastor of Grace Fellowship for 3 years. He was at the height of his professional success. The church was thriving. Donations were up. Attendance was growing. He was increasingly invited to speak at conferences and other churches. His book, A Guide for Christian Families based on his teachings, had been published and was selling reasonably well. I was lying in bed next to him, and I felt absolutely nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even the anxiety I usually felt. Just a complete absence of feeling. It was like I was watching my life from very far away, like I was observing a stranger going through the motions. And I realized something in that moment. I didn't want this anymore. I didn't want this marriage. I didn't want this life. I didn't want this version of myself. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know how I would leave. I didn't know what would happen to my life, to my reputation, to my place in the community. But I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't continue living this way. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just laid there in the dark, thinking. And for the first time in years, I felt something other than paralysis. I felt the tiniest spark of something that might have been hope, or might have been just the recognition that change was possible. I didn't know it then, but that night was the beginning of my escape. After that night in 2015, I spent several months in a strange state of limbo. I hadn't done anything to change my situation, but I was no longer willing to pretend that everything was fine. It was like I had woken up from a long sleep, and I couldn't go back to sleep, even though I wanted to because the waking world was terrifying. During this time, I started noticing things about Daniel that I had been refusing to see. Or maybe I had been seeing them, but I had been rationalizing them as normal, as acceptable, as somehow justified by his position as a spiritual leader. I noticed how he talked to me when we were alone versus how he talked to me in public. In public, he was attentive. He would put his hand on my back. He would compliment me. He would make me feel valued. But the moment we got home, his entire demeanor would change. He would become critical and cold. "You talked too much at the church event," he would say. "You were dominating the conversation." People were looking at me like I couldn't control my wife. I hadn't been dominating anything. I had been having a normal conversation with another woman about her work. But in Daniel's interpretation, anything I did that drew attention to myself was a failure on his part as my husband to lead me properly. I noticed how he interpreted scripture in ways that always seemed to benefit him. He would preach about marital submission and rarely, if ever, talk about husbands loving their wives as Christ loved the church, which is the counterbalance to that submission passage. He would talk about wives respecting their husbands, but rarely talk about husbands respecting their wives. I noticed how he controlled my money. I had a job. I was earning a salary, but Daniel controlled the family finances. He decided what I could spend money on. He decided if I could buy something without asking him. He would review my credit card statements and question purchases. "Do you really need new shoes?" He would ask if I spent $50 on a pair of shoes. That's irresponsible. That's not what a woman who claims to be a Christian steward should be doing. I wasn't extravagant. I wasn't spending excessively. But in his mind, any money I spent on myself was suspect. It was selfish. It was evidence that I didn't understand my role as a wife and the importance of being modest and controlled. I noticed how he isolated me further by making my involvement at church more demanding. He would assign me tasks. He would expect me to attend meetings. He would involve me in his professional life in ways that consumed my time and energy. And if I complained, he would reframe it as spiritual growth, as me being called to serve alongside him. "This is a privilege, Rebecca," he would say, "to be married to a man of God, to be part of this ministry. You should be grateful." And I was grateful. I had been trained my entire life to be grateful. Grateful for being chosen. Grateful for being provided for. Grateful for being led by a man who loved me. But I was starting to understand that gratitude could be a tool for manipulation. That I could be made to feel grateful for things that were actually harming me. During this period, I started keeping a journal. I didn't do it consciously. I didn't sit down and decide to document evidence for some future divorce. I just started writing things down because I needed to get them out of my head. I needed somewhere to process what was happening. March 14th, D expected sex even though I had the flu. I said I wasn't feeling well. He was angry with me for the rest of the day. reminded me that being sick wasn't an excuse, that a wife's body belongs to her husband. I gave in. I felt degraded afterward. April 2nd, Dee criticized my appearance again. Said my stomach was getting soft. Said I need to exercise more. I exercise 4 times a week. I'm not overweight, but I'm starting to believe that I'm not attractive anymore. May 19th, Dee gave me a performance review of my role as a pastor's wife. Gave me a list of areas where I was falling short. Talked about expectations for how I should dress, how I should speak to people, how I should behave. It felt like a job evaluation, not a conversation with a spouse. July 3rd, tried to talk to Dee about seeing a marriage counselor. He refused. Said we don't have problems that a counselor could fix. Said the problem is me not accepting my role. I'm starting to think I need individual therapy, not marriage counseling. Writing these things down, seeing them written out in black and white was important. It was one thing to experience abuse. It was another thing to actually see it documented, to see the pattern, to see it accumulate over time. By mid-2016, I reached out to a therapist. I told Daniel I was struggling with anxiety and wanted to talk to someone about it. He didn't want me to go, but he couldn't find a good reason to forbid it without revealing something about how he actually operated. Just don't tell them about our personal life, he warned me. That's private. That's between us. I don't want our marriage being discussed with a stranger. So I didn't tell my therapist, Dr. Lisa Chun, the full extent of what was happening. But I told her enough. I told her about the pressure around sex. I told her about the criticism of my appearance. I told her about the isolation. And Dr. Chun, who is to this day one of the people I'm most grateful for in my life, immediately recognized what was happening. Rebecca, she said after our 3rd session, what you're describing sounds like a pattern of coercive control. Do you understand what that is? I didn't. Not fully. She explained it to me. How coercive control is when someone uses a pattern of behavior to control another person through fear, humiliation, and intimidation. How it's a form of abuse. How it's often more psychologically damaging than physical abuse because it erodes the victim's sense of self from the inside out. It's not about the sex, Dr. Chin explained. The sex is a tool. It's about him maintaining control over you, about making sure you know that your body is his, that your feelings don't matter, that your autonomy doesn't matter. It's about power. I remember sitting in her office and feeling like I was going to throw up. Because in the span of a 15-minute explanation, my entire marriage suddenly came into focus. All the things I had been rationalizing suddenly looked different. All the ways I had been blaming myself suddenly looked like blame that had been deliberately placed on me by him. But I also felt terror, because if what she was saying was true, then my marriage was not salvageable through communication or compromise or trying harder. My marriage was a fundamentally abusive situation. What do I do? I asked. First, she said, you need to understand that this is not your fault. You didn't cause this. You can't fix this. The only person who can change this is him, and based on what you've told me, I don't think he wants to change. But I'm married to him. We have a life together. His career is in the church. People depend on him. I can't just leave. Can't you? She asked gently. Or have you been made to believe that you can't leave? That question haunted me, because I realized in that moment that I had never actually asked myself if I could leave. I had simply accepted that I couldn't, that it was impossible, that the consequences would be too severe. But what if I was wrong? Over the next year, Dr. Chun helped me start to see my situation more clearly. She helped me understand that I wasn't broken or inadequate, that my resistance to Daniel's demands was actually my body trying to protect me, that the anxiety I felt wasn't a personal failure. It was a normal response to an abnormal situation. She also helped me start to plan, not in an aggressive way, not in a way that felt like I was plotting against Daniel, but in a way that was about creating safety and preparing for the possibility that I might need to leave. You need to understand what your legal rights are, Dr. Chin said. You need to understand what you would get in a divorce. You need to have information, because information is power. So I started researching. I looked up divorce laws in Tennessee. I read about spousal support and asset division. I even called a divorce attorney, and had a consultation to understand my options. I also started rebuilding connections with people I had isolated from. I reached out to my parents. I reconnected with a friend from college who had always been supportive. I started to rebuild my sense of self outside of my role as a pastor's wife. And all the while, I continued to live with Daniel. I continued to maintain the image. I continued to show up at church on Sundays. I continued to be the devoted pastor's wife in public. But privately, I was beginning to understand what was happening, and I was beginning to believe that I deserved better. By the end of 2016, I knew that I was going to leave. I didn't know when or exactly how, but I knew it was going to happen. And that knowledge, terrifying as it was also liberating. The decision to leave was not a single moment. It was a series of moments that added up, a gradual accumulation of realizations that I couldn't stay. The first real catalyst came in January 2017. Daniel, in a moment of what he probably thought was casual honesty, revealed something to me that changed everything. We were in the car driving home from a church event. He had been drinking at the event, not excessively, but enough that his usual filters were slightly loosened. He started talking about his fantasies, about things he wanted me to do sexually that he had never explicitly asked for before. They were things that I had no interest in, things that made me deeply uncomfortable. When I expressed discomfort, he got angry. "Do you know how many women would be happy to do these things for their husband?" he said. "Do you know how many wives would consider it an honor? You're so ungrateful. You're so selfish. This is exactly why you're failing as a wife." And then he said something that I will never forget. "Maybe I should just get what I need from someone else." He said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather. But it hit me like a physical blow, because I realized in that moment that he had been thinking about being with other women, that he had been contemplating infidelity, perhaps even considering acting on it. I spent that entire night awake, sitting in the dark, thinking about what he had said. And I realized something crucial. I had been blaming myself for his unhappiness, for his dissatisfaction. But what if his unhappiness had nothing to do with me? What if he was going to be unhappy regardless of what I did or didn't do? What if no amount of sacrifice on my part was ever going to be enough? That realization was freeing. The next day, when Daniel went to work, I called Dr. Chun. "I need to make a plan," I said. "I need to leave." Dr. Chun connected me with a divorce attorney named James Mitchell, who specialized in cases involving emotional abuse. James was direct and clear about what I was dealing with and what I needed to do. "First," he said, "we need to document what's happening. The more evidence you have, the better position you'll be in during a divorce. If this goes to court, we want the judge to understand the full scope of what you've experienced." So I became very deliberate about my documentation. I continued my journal, but I became more specific. I documented dates, times, what was said, how I felt. I kept copies of text messages where Daniel was controlling or critical. I took screenshots of emails where he was managing my life. I also started making sure I was financially prepared to leave. I had a job, which meant I had income, but I didn't have liquid savings that I could access without Daniel knowing. So I started a secret savings account at a bank that Daniel didn't use. I began putting money away, not large amounts, but consistent amounts. Over several months, I accumulated enough to cover first month's rent, a security deposit, and some living expenses for a few months. I also connected with legal aid services to understand what I would receive in a divorce. In Tennessee, assets acquired during a marriage are typically divided equitably, though not necessarily equally. I was entitled to half of the marital property. I was also entitled to spousal support because I had given up career advancement to support Daniel's career. By the middle of 2017, I had a plan. But I also knew that timing was crucial. I couldn't just pack up and leave. I needed to do this in a way that was safe, both physically and legally. Then, in August 2017, something happened that accelerated my timeline. I found out that Daniel was having an affair. Not from him, from an anonymous email that came to my personal account. The email contained a screenshot of a text message exchange between Daniel and a woman named Sarah. They were clearly involved in a sexual relationship. The messages were explicit. The timeline suggested it had been going on for at least 6 months, maybe longer. My first instinct was shock. Then came the anger. But underneath that was something else, clarity. Because now I had concrete evidence. Now I had something that proved that Daniel's demands on me had never been about love or commitment to our marriage. They had been about control, about power, about satisfying his own needs regardless of my feelings. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I printed the emails. I put them in a secure location. I contacted James Mitchell and told him what I had found. This changes things significantly, James said. Infidelity in Tennessee doesn't necessarily result in a larger share of assets, but it can affect spousal support, and it certainly affects the judge's perception of his character. This is going to help your case. I also discovered, through my research, that Sarah was someone who worked at the church. She was a church employee, which meant that Daniel had been conducting an affair with someone who was in a power dynamic with him at work, which meant that his behavior was not only infidelity, but it was also an abuse of his position of authority. I spent the next month in a strange state of emotional whiplash. I was simultaneously holding the knowledge of his infidelity while continuing to live with him, continue to present as his devoted wife, continue to go to church and smile and pretend. By September 2017, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to execute my plan. I had found an apartment. It was a small one-bedroom in a different part of Nashville, far enough away that I wouldn't run into him or church members constantly. I had saved enough money to make the first payment. I had talked to my parents about what was happening, and they had offered to help me financially if I needed it. I also reached out to Sarah. I didn't do it to confront her or to shame her. I did it because I thought she deserved to know the full truth of what Daniel was. I sent her a message explaining our situation, explaining how he had been pressuring me for sex daily, explaining that he had told me he was going to find satisfaction elsewhere. I told her that if she was involved with him, she should know that he was capable of manipulation and deception. She didn't respond to my message, and I later learned that Daniel had told her I was a jealous, unstable woman who was trying to cause problems. So she didn't believe me. But that's okay. I did what I could. I tried to give her information so she could make her own decisions. On September 15th, 2017, while Daniel was at work, I packed a suitcase with the essentials. I took important documents. I took photos and sentimental items. I left the keys on the kitchen table and drove to my new apartment. I didn't leave a note. I didn't leave an explanation. I simply left. The next day, James filed the divorce petition. Daniel's first response was to try to get me to come back. He called constantly. He showed up at my apartment. He told me that we could work through this, that he was sorry, that he would change. But he also did something else. He started telling people at the church that I had abandoned him, that I was unstable, that I was spreading lies about him. He also, unsurprisingly, denied the affair. He claimed the emails were fabricated. He claimed I had hacked into his accounts. He claimed I was trying to destroy his reputation out of spite. But I had James, and I had documentation, and I had the truth. The divorce proceeding was not kind. I want to be clear about that from the outset. Even though I had evidence of infidelity and abuse, even though the law was technically on my side, even though I had a good attorney, the process of going through a divorce while being the one who left was brutal. The church community, or at least a significant portion of it, sided with Daniel. He was the pastor. He had a position of authority. He had spent years building his image as a spiritual leader. And I was the wife who had abandoned him. People I had considered friends stopped talking to me. Church members who I had worked alongside for years suddenly looked at me with suspicion, or pity, or disdain. My reputation in that community was destroyed in a matter of days. Daniel's attorney was aggressive. He argued that I had no valid reason to leave. He argued that every example I gave of controlling behavior was simply Daniel exercising his role as the head of the household. He argued that the sexual pressure I described was not abuse. It was normal marital relations. A wife has a responsibility to her husband, Daniel's attorney argued in one hearing. The plaintiff is exaggerating normal marital disagreements and trying to portray her husband as some kind of monster. I had to sit in court and listen to my pain being minimized. I had to sit and hear a lawyer argue that what I had experienced was not abuse, it was normal. But I also had Dr. Chin testify. She explained the pattern of coercive control. She explained how the sexual pressure was a tool of manipulation, not an expression of love. She explained that my response to this pattern, anxiety, isolation, loss of self, was consistent with someone experiencing psychological abuse. I also testified. I had to sit on the stand and talk about the most intimate and painful parts of my life. I had to describe the sexual pressure in detail. I had to talk about my loss of autonomy, my financial dependence, my isolation. I had to answer questions from Daniel's attorney, who was clearly trying to make me look unreasonable or vindictive. "Isn't it true that you never told your husband these were problems?" he asked. I did tell him. Multiple times, I responded. "But you continued to have sexual relations with him?" "Yes, because he made it clear that refusal would result in punishment. Punishment in the form of cold treatment, criticism, withdrawal of affection." "So you chose to have relations rather than face those consequences?" "I didn't choose. I was coerced." The cross-examination was brutal, but I got through it. Daniel testified as well. He presented himself as a confused husband who didn't understand why his wife had suddenly abandoned him. He denied the affairs initially, then admitted to one indiscretion, but framed it as something that happened because his marriage was already failing. He denied that he had pressured me for sex, claiming that I had misinterpreted normal marital relations. "I love my wife," he said on the stand. "I never forced her to do anything. We had a normal sexual relationship. If she experienced it differently, that's her interpretation, but it doesn't match reality." Listening to him rewrite our history was infuriating, but I had to sit there and listen. My attorney had told me not to react, not to show emotion, not to give the judge any reason to think I was unstable or vengeful. The infidelity was harder for him to deny because I had the concrete evidence, but he tried to minimize it. He said it was a brief lapse in judgment. He said it didn't negate the good work he had done in his marriage or in his church. After weeks of testimony and arguments, the judge issued her decision. She awarded me 40% of the marital assets. She determined that because I had given up career advancement to support Daniel's career, but because I also had the ability to earn income, I would not receive long-term spousal support. However, she awarded me alimony for 5 years to give me time to rebuild my career and my life. She also issued a finding that confirmed there had been patterns of controlling behavior in the marriage. This finding didn't directly affect the financial settlement, but it was important for the record. It meant that a court had officially recognized that what I had experienced was abuse. Daniel was also ordered to pay my attorney fees and a portion of my therapy costs. When the judge read the decision, I cried. Not tears of victory, but tears of release. Because it was over. Not completely over, because Daniel appealed the decision, but over in the sense that I had finally been heard. A person in authority had listened to my story and had believed me. Daniel eventually dropped the appeal after a few months. I think his attorney made clear to him that he was not going to win, and continuing to fight would only cost him more money. But there was one more thing I needed to do. I needed to tell my story to the church. Grace Fellowship Church had a board of elders that governed decisions about the church and the pastor. Daniel had been able to survive the divorce proceedings partly because he had convinced people at the church that I was lying, that I was trying to destroy him out of spite. I requested a meeting with the board. I brought James with me. I brought documentation. I presented the facts of what had happened. The board's response was disappointing but not surprising. They said they appreciated me sharing my perspective. They said they would talk to Daniel about appropriate pastoral boundaries, but they did not remove him from his position. They did not issue a public statement about what had occurred. They did not really hold him accountable in any meaningful way. The church is not a court, one of the board members said. We can't make determinations about personal matters in people's marriages. But the church had no problem making determinations about my reputation. The church had no problem allowing Daniel to position himself as the victim. The church had no problem maintaining the status quo in order to avoid scandal. I was disappointed, but I was not surprised. I had already made my escape. I had already reclaimed my life. The church's response mattered less to me than it would have a year earlier. What mattered was that I was free. It took me several years to understand what had happened to me. Not on an intellectual level. I understood the mechanics of it fairly quickly. But on an emotional and spiritual level, it took much longer to process the fact that I had spent a decade of my life in a situation where my autonomy was systematically eroded. The first year after my separation was the hardest. I was living alone for the first time in my adult life. I had a job, but my income was cut because I was no longer married to someone earning a significant salary. I was managing a studio apartment on my own. I was starting over. I had also lost my community. The church community that I had been part of for so many years was no longer available to me. People who I thought were friends revealed that their loyalty had been conditional on my status as the pastor's wife. But I also had something I hadn't had in years: autonomy. I could make decisions about my own life. I could spend time with who I wanted. I could eat what I wanted. I could sleep when I wanted. I could decide what to do with my body. These things seemed small, but they were profound. After years of having every aspect of my life subject to scrutiny and control, the simple ability to make decisions about myself was revolutionary. I continued therapy with Dr. Chen. We worked through the trauma of what I had experienced. We worked through the shame that I carried about the marriage. We worked through the anger and the grief. There was grief, which surprised me. I expected anger. I expected relief. But there was also grief for the life I had imagined, for the marriage I thought I was building, for the version of myself who kept believing that if I tried harder, smiled softer, spoke gentler, scheduled better, I could finally earn kindness. Grief sat with me in quiet rooms, in the laundromat on Wednesday nights, in the grocery aisle when I reached for his favorite brand out of muscle memory, in the middle of the night when the radiator hissed and the apartment felt like a question I didn't know how to answer. Dr. Chen asked me to name it out loud. Say what you lost, she said. I lost the illusion that I was safe because I was chosen, I said. And I lost the habit of asking permission to be a person. We built new habits, one ordinary ritual at a time. Monday, therapy. Tuesday, walk after work, phone on do not disturb. Wednesday, laundry and a podcast that made me laugh in the detergent aisle. Thursday, dinner with Mara from my office, the kind of friend who brings soup when you can't explain why you need soup. Friday, a standing date with myself, movie, book, or nothing. Saturday morning, farmer's market, one fresh flower. Sunday, pancakes and silence. The point wasn't productivity. The point was ownership. I made a self-respect folder on my phone and filled it with screenshots of the tiny ways I kept my word to myself. A boundary I held, a run I finished, an email I didn't send. When the old voice whispered, "You're weak," I opened the folder and remembered proof I wasn't. I learned to sleep again. Not just fall into exhausted blackout, but lay my head down and trust the night to hold. Dr. Chen taught me a grounding exercise. Notice 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear, 2 I could smell, 1 I could taste. On shaky nights, I sat on the edge of my bed and named them. The shadow of the ficus on the wall, the scratch in the hardwood, the hum of the refrigerator, the rain in the alley, the peppermint tea cooling on the dresser. My body started to believe me when I said, "We're okay." Finances were a second language I decided to learn. I opened a high-yield savings account, built an emergency fund with automatic transfers that felt tiny until they didn't, and took a free community class on budgeting. The numbers weren't glamorous. They were steady. I watched the balance tick up like a candle burning in reverse, more light each month, not less. The absence of the church was a hole I felt most on Sundays. For years, Sunday meant stage lights and polite smiles and being on. Now I let the day be blank, and I colored it in slowly. Sometimes I streamed a service from a different city, a place where no one knew my name, and I could listen without performing. Sometimes I walked by the river with a thermos of coffee and let the wind do what sermons had tried to do, move what was heavy inside me. I learned there is a difference between faith and press releases about faith. I kept one and let the other go. Occasionally, people from the old circle reached out. "We're praying for reconciliation. Have you tried being more patient? He's under a lot of pressure." The messages were always gentle and always somehow assignments for me. Dr. Chin suggested a sentence I could keep in my pocket. I'm not available for conversations that minimize what happened. I typed it into a note and pasted it when I needed it. Boundaries are a kindness you give yourself that sometimes benefits other people. There were practical steps that felt ceremonial. I changed the locks on the storage unit where I kept the last of my boxes. I returned a set of keys that wasn't mine anymore. I took my ring to a jeweler and asked them to melt it down into something else. The jeweler asked what I wanted to make. Nothing, I said, and surprised us both. I want to remember that gold can be repurposed, even if this isn't the gold I choose to wear. I used the money to buy a solid pair of boots for winter and paid 2 therapy sessions ahead. Investments, both. I wrote letters I didn't send, one to him, one to the woman I used to be, one to the friend who looked away when I needed her to see. The letter to my old self was the hardest. I apologized for ignoring her panic. I thanked her for keeping records. I told her that someday she would make pancakes on a quiet Sunday and feel joy without bargaining for it. The first time I ran into him after the separation was at a grocery store in front of the yogurt. Of course it was. Life loves a metaphor. He was wearing a coat I'd picked out and a smile that looked familiar and broken at the same time. "You look good," he said, like a test. I nodded. "I'm well," I answered, and felt the truth click into place. He tried small talk, stepping closer like the past had only been a misunderstanding of distance. I took a step back I didn't explain. "I'm not available to talk here," I said. "Please contact my attorney if you need to discuss logistics." I put the plain yogurt in my cart, my choice, my shelf, and walked away. My hands shook until I reached the parking lot, and then they didn't. The work wasn't linear. Some days I woke up and felt 10 years lighter. Some days grief slipped its arm through mine and walked me to work. Healing didn't ask me to be inspirational. It asked me to be honest. Dr. Chin said, "Let's measure progress by the time it takes you to recognize what's happening, not by the absence of hard days." By that measure, I was breaking records. I caught the old pattern quickly, the one where I collapsed to the size of someone else's comfort, and I chose differently. I joined a support group that met in the back room of a public library on Tuesdays. Fluorescent lights, metal chairs, the smell of old paper and new hope. We didn't compare pain. We told the truth. We laughed more than I expected. There was a woman who always brought a bag of clementines and peeled them like patience. There was a man who said almost nothing and then once said, "I'm practicing being the kind of person who doesn't apologize for existing," and we all nodded like we just heard the weather forecast for our lives. I started lifting weights again. There's something clean about picking up heavy things and setting them down on purpose. I watched numbers go up that had nothing to do with credit scores or approval ratings. Deadlift, 95, then 115, then 135. My coach, a kind woman with a barbell tattoo, said, "Your back is stronger than your fear." The first time I pulled 155, I cried a little and pretended it was sweat. It wasn't. It was recognition. This is what it feels like to carry only what's mine. People asked, cautiously, if I was dating. For a long time, the answer was no. Then I tried a coffee with a friend of a friend. He was smart and gentle and made a joke about how he never reads instruction manuals, and I felt my stomach drop because that used to be charming to me. I realized in real time that I prefer people who read directions. We parted kindly. Later I wrote in my journal, "I'm not auditioning anymore. I'm observing." That shift alone felt like a graduation. Not everything needed to be relearned. Some things just needed to be remembered. I remembered that I love cooking when no one is grading it. I remembered that music in the kitchen can fix almost anything up to and including a bad Tuesday. I remembered that I am good at my job, and that good doesn't mean exhaust myself to prove it. I remembered that the way I dress, the way I laugh, the way I take up space, none of it is a report card. One afternoon, almost 2 years in, I walked past the old church. The doors were open for some midweek event. A woman I knew stepped out and, seeing me, startled like she'd seen a ghost. "We miss you," she said. Forgiveness." I held up my hand, not to stop her, but to stop myself from stepping into an argument. I have forgiven enough to stop bleeding, I said. Forgiveness is not a key that opens my door to anyone. I wished her well. I went home and watered my plants and let quiet be my service. There were still administrative things to untangle. Names on accounts. A stubborn bill that kept arriving as if paper could boss me. My attorney handled most of it. When I did have to make phone calls, I wrote a script, state the issue, state the solution I'm asking for. Thank them, hang up. Script saved me from spiraling into explanations I didn't know. The last tangible piece of that old life was a storage box of notebooks, my logs from the years I was keeping records to keep myself sane. For a while I couldn't look at them. They felt radioactive. Then one fall afternoon, I made tea, opened the windows, and read. Not to relive, to witness. The entries bent time. There were nights when I had written in tiny, cramped letters and left coffee rings like moons. There were lines that sounded like someone else had written them, and lines that sounded exactly like me. The me who finally kept her promise and left. I think those pages out loud. Then I scanned what I needed to keep for legal reasons, and I burned the rest in a small outdoor fire pit a friend lent me. The flames were ordinary. The relief was not. On the anniversary of the day I moved out, I took myself to the ocean. It was cold enough to keep most people away, which is how I like the beach. Windy, honest, no performance. I stood at the edge and let the water lick my boots. I said the names of the things I was done carrying. The obligation to be polite about pain, the project of being perfect, the theology of swallowing myself whole. Then I said the names of the things I was keeping: tenderness, boundaries, laughter, a ridiculous yellow umbrella I'd bought on impulse and loved fiercely. I walked back to the car lighter by exactly the weight of my old explanations. If you've been watching this and waiting for the part where I tell you I'm fixed, I won't. I'm not a project, I'm a person. I am happy and I am still healing. I have bad days and I have better tools. I don't grade my progress anymore by how quiet I can be about what hurts. I don't mistake someone else's urgency for my emergency. I don't let the word love do the job that the word respect refuses to do. Sometimes, late, I picture the house we used to share. I don't romanticize it. I just see it clearly. The exact color of the walls, the cabinet that stuck, the chair where I learned to write sentences that changed my life. I thank that version of me for surviving long enough to become this one. Then I turn off the light and go to bed. My bed, on my side, at the time I choose. Months into this new life, I woke before my alarm to ring, tapping the window like someone asking permission to enter. I made coffee and sat at the small table by the window. The city smelled like wet pavement and fresh beginnings. I opened my notebook, not the old log of harms, but a new journal, and wrote the only metrics I care about now. Asterisk, did I tell myself the truth today? Asterisk, did I protect my peace without apology? Asterisk, did I choose connection over performance? Asterisk, did I feed my body and my hope? I checked, yes, more days than not. That is my win rate. I won't pretend there was a single moment when the nightmare ended. It softened. It lost its power to set the terms. It became a story I can tell without shaking. And that, more than anything, is reclamation. Not that it never happened, but that it doesn't get to decide what happens next. If you're listening to this and something in you is nodding, even if the rest of you is shaking, here is what I want to give you. The way others gave it to me when I couldn't carry it alone. You are not overreacting. You are not hard to love. You are not obligated to stay where you are made small. You deserve to take up the space of your own life without asking first. I turned the page and wrote one last line, the kind you speak into a room and mean. I am done narrating myself in someone else's grammar. Then I closed the notebook, put on my boots, and stepped into the day that was already mine.